This is much more than a Pioneer SX-1980 restoration video. I'm going to show you where to get the documents, where to get the parts, and the tools needed to fix any piece of vintage audio equipment that you may have. In addition, I'm going to talk about electrolytic capacitors and if you even need to change them in your vintage equipment. So there's a ton to cover in this video, so let's get started. If you haven't already, please subscribe. I just want to give you a little background on the Pioneer SX-1980. It was produced from 1978 to 1980 and output an incredible 270 watts per channel into 8 ohms at 0.03% distortion. This was right at the height of the receiver wars. And this is the most powerful receiver that Pioneer ever produced, and one of the most powerful that anyone ever produced. This video shows the repair and restoration of a Pioneer SX-1980. This one's in very good cosmetic condition, but after 40 years, it's in need of some repairs and restoration. I've begun to disassemble the SX-1980. Comes apart fairly easily at this point. You know, of course you take the covers off top and bottom, and then I've already removed the faceplate. You've got to remove the knobs. No difficulties there. It's pretty standard as far as a vintage receiver to get it apart to this point anyway. It's a little bit dusty in there, but boy have I seen worse. It's really not too bad, and this should be a fairly easy cleanup. The Pioneer SX-1980 is a very reliable receiver. Where people do have issues is the power supply. Got a reputation for running very hot. After 40 years, most of them need some sort of a restoration and a component replacement. Sits at the bottom of the receiver, and the heat just stays there. It has no way to really get out of the chassis, so it just runs very warm. You can see in some of these pictures very dark spots, and this is where the transistors from the pictures above were removed with their heat sinks. And you can see that it gets warm there, and that's been for 40 years. So on this board, I'll replace all of the transistors on the power supply, just because they've been through a rough life for 40 years, and it's pretty amazing they made it, this long with the heat generated. I will also change out all of the electrolytic capacitors on this assembly. Once again, they've had a hard life. Hopefully it'll go another 40 years. I also used deoxit to clean up the pots, the switches, the various contacts in the unit. I also use, like this receiver is pretty good size, it's pretty heavy, there's a lot to it, and what I do is I'll use tie wraps to kind of give me a third hand. Like in this picture, I show a tie wrap at the top. It's just kind of hanging there, and it gives me that third hand to do two things. One, to access the components easier, but also not to twist the wires back and forth excessively. I mean, this is all point-to-point wiring. I mean, there's no modular connectors, and this is just the way they did it in the late 70s, both commercial and like this consumer equipment. They used a wire wrap gun at the factory, and they took those wires and they spun them onto the pins, and that's fine and dandy until they get 40 years old and you start bending them around. So I went through all the various assemblies in the SX-1980, changing all the electrolytics or bipolar capacitors that were in it. Also changing some of the transistors that are known to be noisy. And after 40 years, again, it wouldn't be a surprise. And many of these transistors are 2 and 3 cents a piece. While you're in there, you can put a modern equivalent in and have peace of mind that you probably won't have to get back into this for for some time. At least hopefully you won't. As I said, this is a time-consuming project. You're not going to get it done in one evening. There's a lot to take apart. Just take it one step at a time, and you can probably get through it. The push-button switches are very problematic in this unit. Not just this unit, but any of them that have them. They're very difficult to get at, to clean, unless you remove the assembly itself. In this case, this unit has a pretty good amount of slack in the cables. So if you do remove something, you can usually work with it somewhat, and that's what I've done. To clean these switches better, I've removed each assembly and then just laid it out in some manner to where I can get at everything easier. The big thing too is it's going to take you time to get this apart, and if you get it back together and you've got some kind of intermittent problem with some of these switches or the controls, you're going to hate to tear it back apart again. And tell me how I know it's a good idea to make sure you clean these well while you do have it apart. You know, the push button switches really are a leading cause of the intermittent issues. Now if you got a channel totally out, or you've got some other problem, you know, blowing fuses, this isn't your problem. But, you know, sound coming and going, you know, it's kind of low on one channel and you screw around with the buttons and starts working. It's probably these guys here. I use a piece of cardboard, you know, when I've got these assemblies out. Deoxit's a wonderful product to spray, and it gets almost anywhere you want it to get, but it also gets in places you probably don't want it to get. And so, you know, I'll just squeeze some cardboard in there, and so when I spray it, most of it stays where I want it to stay, and it's not all over the chassis somewhere, because it'll certainly attract dirt over time. So you just want to, you know, use the spray the way you should use it, and that just requires you to put something around it, you know, to catch the spray, and I use a little bit of cardboard. And these push button switches, you can tell many times if you've gotten it into the switch well. There's little holes on the top. You can kind of see them there in the middle of these three switches. And when you spray at the front where this spring is, where you see the blue plastic and then the white one, the blue. You spray right up in there, and if you get it up in the switch correctly, that spray will come right out of those holes. So you kind of know, hey, I got it. I got it where I was supposed to get it. And now here's a time-consuming thing too. Once you've done that, don't push them 2 or 3 times and think you're done. Push them 30, 40, 50 times. I know it seems ridiculous, but once again, you want to make sure that you've got these clean. So you've taken all this time to take it apart, you get it back together, and now one of your push button switches is intermittent. You're going, oh no, because you know it's going to take some work to get back in there. So take the extra time, push those switches more times than you want to, and it'll pay off at the end. You can get these boards in a position, you know, where you can work on them. There's enough slack in those cables, and by using tie wraps and getting them into a position that you need, you can work on them and get to them. And again, you want to bend these things a minimum amount of times. Think any wire. This wire is no different than any other wire. Bend it back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, and you know, eventually something's going to break. So try to leave them in a position where you don't have to do that often. And there's a very good chance you'll get through all this and not break any wires. If you do break a wire, that's all right too. Most of us don't have wire wrap guns, and what you do if you break a wire, you're probably going to need to solder it back on the pin. You know, put a few twists on there, hit it with a little solder, and you'll be good to go. I used modern test equipment to gain match transistors that are needed to be gained. Not every transistor needs to be gain matched, but some of them in the signal path need to be gain matched. So that's just, you know, kind of what it says. So when you're using the volume control, one side doesn't sound louder than the other. I mean, there's a few spots where that's important, and so I use an Atlas DCA Pro to match the gain of those transistors. There's some places I use filmed capacitors where there were low value electrolytics. Again, you got to do a little bit of a little bit of research before you begin a project, and you know, many of these have been done, and so you can find out what other people have done and what they shouldn't have done. You know, as I said, there's some of these assemblies don't have many components, but they're still 40 years old. A couple of capacitors and a transistor to change here and there. I did it on all the different assemblies, even if they didn't have a whole lot of components on them. Started to reinstall everything back in. I've got the top, when I say top, the ones nearest the radio dial back in, and then the ones that are down below, the couple assemblies, then I'll put them in right under it. They just go right back up in there and you screw them in. You know, now it's probably a good time, you've done quite a bit of work here, to just give it a shot and make sure everything's okay, and I did that. I noticed I had an issue with the FM, and so I took a look at that. Really, I should have said this before, but I'll say it now. You should have the service manual for this unit, and this service manual is available from the internet. HiFiEngine.com, which is a great resource for vintage audio manuals and schematics. They have it, and you really should download that first before you start this. I should be mentioning that. Also, if you're going to, you know, in my case, I had an FM issue. So if you're going to mess around the FM section, you really need to have the proper equipment, and I'll repeat it for the 5th time, the service manual that'll tell you what to move, when to move it, and where to look at the signals and what you should have. But I use an ST-1000A FM alignment generator, and that was pretty much state-of-the-art back in the day. So still does a great job. It's vintage itself, and it does a great job with the FM section of vintage audio equipment. Once I aligned the FM section, I could then tune and lock into stations, you know, much better. You know, before I did the alignment, you know, the signal strength would show maximum strength, but the tuning, the center tuning knob would be off, the fine tune lead would not locked to quartz locked, and you know, there's just little, it worked, but it wasn't quite right. And after 40 years, some of these components drift. It really didn't take much to get it back working. So I moved on from there, and I'm gonna replace the filter capacitors. Are they still good? I think they are. I've got some equipment that can test filter capacitors, but they're 40 years old. You know, I'm doing all this work. Why not change them out? The 4 filter capacitors, I believe they were about $25 each. And mentioning those, probably there was another $100 in capacitors and transistors in this project. So you probably got a couple $100 for the material, you know, and then if you can do it yourself, great. If you've got to have someone else do it for you, it's going to cost you some money, because it's a lot of time. It just takes a lot of time to do this. You know, as I said, you're not going to get it done overnight, but if you're going to do it, you might as well do it right and not be in there and change out one thing and then have to come back in a year and do something else, or in 5. So as I said, decided to change out the filter capacitors. No big deal getting them in or out. You know, they're still available, fortunately. You know, not from Pioneer, but the filter capacitors that will fit in here, the correct diameters and everything, are still available. So I don't know how much longer they'll be available, but right now they are. So I went ahead and started to replace those. Of course, clean the chassis up and everything, you know, while you pull them out, and started to install them. And hopefully the new ones will go 40 years too. So I've gotten the 4 installed. Gonna hook them up. Got them in the chassis, and then I just got to hook them up here at the bottom. So I just put it up on the bench and, you know, did some basic, just use the controls. Played with it a little bit. Then I set the idle current and the DC offset, Again, the service manual has the procedure for that. Get the service manual. You're not going to be able to know how to do this if you don't. You know, there wasn't no issues there. The DC offset was just about 0 and was able to set the idle current just about to spec. You always want to do that, you know, after you've rebuilt a unit and before you take it to bench testing. And that's another thing. You know, you see so many people, you know, they recap these things, but they have no equipment to test it. You know, there's nothing wrong with recapping, believe me. I think anything 40 years old needs to have the electrolytic capacitors changed out and sometimes other things, you know, just because they have a history of failing. But when you're done with all this, you know, you really need to have a bench test. And I use a signal generator. I also use some vintage test equipment. Again, some sound technology vintage test equipment that was used on many, many test benches back in the day. I use an ST3200 audio analyzer, which is, again, a piece of vintage test equipment from the 80s, but it does a great job. And your ears are wonderful. This test equipment will validate what you've done, and you'll feel good that that not only your ears say you've done good, but the test equipment does too. So, you know, you can run it through various frequencies and through various wattages. In this one's case, it did very good. You know, the volume control really, all through its range, stayed 1 to 2% between the channels. So, you know, here I'm showing 84.1 watts continuous out of the left and 84.8. That's good. You know, would you like it perfect? Maybe. But that certainly is well within spec, and that's something you're not gonna hear. So I also calibrated the power meters. All the specs are there for you to test. As I said, you can test most of these if you want to with the proper test equipment. So I'm just about done here. What I'll do, I'll just leave it up here on the test bench and just let it run and just make sure, give it a little bit of burn-in time. And if all is well, we'll wrap it up. So I replaced about 135 capacitors and transistors during this restoration. You know, always use respected names. They're just a few pennies more. You know, if you're doing all this, you know, you could buy the El Cheapos, you know, and save a few pennies each, and at the end, a few dollars each, but it's crazy. It doesn't matter any particular brand, but, you know, any of the big brands where, in this unit's case, I used a lot of Nishinikon, you know, Capacitors, a great company, but if you use Panasonic or, you know, there's tons of other ones that are reputable, and I don't know that one capacitor is better than the other, but I'll tell you that a brand new capacitor is better than a 40-year-old one, whatever it is. So just buy good stuff. One final check, and I'm going to be all done with it. I'm going to go through and, you know, play with the FM and play with the controls and just make sure before I move it off here, you know, she's ready to go. And there goes the heard the speaker relay, so that's always a good sign. So I think she's probably come to life here. Well, there you have it, my Pioneer SX-1980. What a beautiful piece of equipment. There is just nothing made today that is similar to it. You take a look at this, and even people who know nothing about audio have one of these sitting in your living room, in your man cave, and have it on. People are going to come look at it, even if they don't know what it is. You're going to be immediately drawn to it. So it's just an amazing piece of equipment. And speaking about amazing, have any of you guys been following the pricing on vintage audio stuff? Holy smokes. A couple of SX-1980s just recently sold on eBay, one for $10,400 and the other one for $7,900. And there was another one over 7,000. Incredible. I think that's incredible. And I think to myself, well, maybe I'm doing this video to make a for sale ad, right? Maybe it's time to sell it. What would I go buy? So let's say I were to sell it, you know, for $10,000 or $15,000. What am I going to do? go out and buy some better clothes, get a new car that I don't need or want, it would be difficult to sell it. I guess every man's got his price, right? So I think I would really miss this SX-1980, even if I were to sell it for $10,000. You know, my inclination on one side of it, I mean, is like 10 grand. Sold. I'd take it. But on the other side, I think about it and I think, well, okay, it's gone and I've got money. But what am I going to do with that? I'm going to be thinking, well, I should have kept my Pioneer SX-1980. An interesting thing is I got this in 2004, this 1980, and I remember paying $700 for it. And I remember thinking, heeing and hawing to myself. I went to see it, and it had the box. Matter of fact, and of course I still have, it has the original box, original packing and everything. And I can remember thinking $700, jeez, you know, I don't know, you know, and thinking, is this something I should do or not? And I bit the bullet and I bought it for $700. And obviously looking at it now, wow, what a bargain, right? Again, it's not about the value to me. It's just an incredible piece of equipment. And when I was growing up, there's no way I had anything like this. I didn't have, you know, this particular unit, you know, retailed for $1,295. I probably had that in my entire stereo. I can't keep this stuff forever, and I don't think anybody else in my family wants it. So at some point, I am going to have to sell it because I think they'd rather have the cash than the equipment instead of having them, you know, figure out what to do with it. But right now, it's very difficult. It'd be very difficult to sell, but I'm telling you, these prices are getting to the point where, well, maybe. I just wanted to talk a little bit about that, just about how the pricing's gone just crazy. Now I want to tell you about two great resources that are available for free on the internet. One is HiFiEngine.com, which I talk about all the time. First up is HiFi Engine. Just go to Google, type in your browser HiFi Engine, and the first thing that comes up should be HiFi Engine. And just click on that link, and there's a search box at the top. Seeing that I worked on a Pioneer SX-1980 in this video, that's what I'm going to search on. And there's some ads at the top, but if you scroll down just a little bit, you'll see a link to HiFi Engine's brochures and manuals on this piece of equipment. And as you can see, there's several available. The owner's manual is available. The service manual is available. And also available are brochures. And I don't know about you guys, but I can remember back when I was in my teens going to the local retail audio shops, which we had a bunch. I lived in a small, medium-sized city, but there must have been a half a dozen different small audio retailers, and they all had racks of brochures. And as I mentioned earlier, I don't think I ever seriously considered an XS 1980 because it was just out of my price range, and I don't ever remember picking up a brochure. But these brochures are another thing that just aren't around anymore, right? You walk into an audio shop today and you're lucky to find anything whatsoever on any of the pieces of equipment. But it's interesting reading about this equipment. Like they talk about what wire they're using. They talk about technically how this piece of equipment works. I mean, to be honest with you, 95% of it, I don't know what they're talking about. You know, but back in the day, this is what sold product. It made it seem like theirs was better. You know, the Pioneer was trying to convince you to buy a Pioneer instead of buying a Sansui, a Marantz, or some other product. It's amazing the amount of information that you can find out there on the internet about all the pieces of equipment. I just think it's a great resource for you. Now, the next one is World Radio History. Again, back to Google, World Radio, well, let's see, yeah, Radio History. Type that in your browser and up will come right at the top, World Radio History. Click on that. This If you want to go down, as they say, go down the rabbit's hole for about 10 years, oh my God. There's so much stuff in here, not just about vintage audio, but electronics in general. Doesn't matter if you're a ham operator, if you're a AM/FM broadcaster, it doesn't matter. I'm scrolling down to S's to go to Stereo Review, and they have all of the publications for all of this. It's just incredible amount of information. So I clicked on Stereo Review. They have every issue of Stereo Review since 1958 when it started, up through the late 90s when the publication ceased to exist. So I was working on the 1980. So I did a search and I found out that it was in the December, a review of it was in the December 1978 issue. I love going back and looking at this stuff. I used to subscribe to Stereo Review and High Fidelity and all of them. What a great resource. So I wanted to share that information with you too. No matter what you're into, world radio history, it's just an amazing site. And you can go back and this video is about my Pioneer SX-1980, and that's why I showed examples with that. But you guys out there that don't have a 1980, you have another Pioneer or you have another product, same thing. You can go in there and look up your Macintosh, look at the old brochures, look at the old articles on it. Get the owner's manual, get the service manuals on all this equipment. It's at your fingertips. It's there. Use your phone, your tablet, your computer, whatever it is you're using at home. And it's just amazing free resources that we didn't have back 40 years ago. Now that I've gone over a couple of sites that I think are a great resource for any vintage audio fan or electronics fan in general, I'm going to talk about electrolytic capacitors and should you replace them or shouldn't you. Today I want to talk about electrolytic capacitors in vintage audio equipment and whether you should change them or you shouldn't change them or you should change some of them. Just generally out there on the internet, there's all types of different positions. The one thing that I see missing out there, whether you're for it or against it, it's a lot of personal opinion. It's my technician said, it's in my experience, it's all these things that have some validity, but in today's world, you can go right to the manufacturer's websites and they'll tell you all about the design of them, the testing and validation of them, and the reliability of them. You don't have to go to some forum and some guy says do it or don't. Go to the manufacturer. And if you Google electrolytic capacitor lifespan, you'll come up with all the manufacturers and also some of the part suppliers that provide links. Like here I show a link to Illinois Capacitor and gives you a little idea of what they're going to talk about. These are the people that are the experts. And here I show, a link from Mauser, a big parts house, but to Elna. They were a big supplier of capacitors in the 60s, 70s, and 80s for Japanese vintage equipment. And they'll tell you everything you wanted to know and even more. Probably more than you wanted to know. Some basic things like this. These are 3 pages out of hundreds. Here's Illinois Capacitor, giving you a little brief 2-page kind of, here, we condensed it. This is kind of like electrolytic capacitors for dummies. They've taken hundreds of pages, and fortunately, somebody wrote it in a way that you can understand it. Now, if you want to keep going, go ahead and do a little bit of math, figure it out for yourself, but I suggest that you get maybe a stiff drink when you do that. This is some of the equipment I've worked on in the past. You can obviously tell that something happened with that capacitor, not good. And here's part of it too that went all over the back of this Akai reel-to-reel. Here's a filter capacitor out of a Pioneer A27. I powered it up, I'd been working on it, and I heard like a sizzling. And I was thinking, well, man, somebody's making some bacon, and that's going to be good. Well, it wasn't bacon, it was the damn amplifier sizzling. So anyway, shut that off, and it's never good having goop like that in your amp. And here's a Sony amp that blew a capacitor, blew the artwork right off. You know, modern test equipment is great. You know, I've got some of it, and I do test some capacitors with, obviously, you look at this capacitor, and what? Might as well just say bad. It's bad, but you can't always go by that. Here I show a schematic. This is a schematic of a Pioneer SX-1080 receiver. Take a look at pin 6 near the top, 76 volts. And pin 8, which is 24 volts, and notice the capacitors off of those pins. One's a 2200 25 volt off the 24 volt pin, and the other's a 470 80 volt off the 76 volt pin. That's pretty tight, right? But the Pioneer, in this case, and all the other manufacturers, they saved money. You save pennies and you make tens of thousands of units. You save a lot of money. And why I bring this up is, in this data from the manufacturers, they talk about how you can reduce the maximum voltage, reduce the temperatures to make these capacitors last longer. Manufacturers going to put in just enough, you know, and that's what they did. But if you were working on this receiver, which I was, what I ended up doing is taking the 25 volt capacitor and upgrading it to a 50. And I also took the 80 volt up to 100. Of course, the same microfarads, you know, 2200 and 470, but just a few pennies more. And again, these data sheets on these manufacturers' websites, if you want to know the difference, they'll say if you lower it 10 degrees Celsius, this is what happens to the reliability of that capacitor. If you run this capacitor 20% under voltage it's rated, here's what you can expect. And the same thing, this shows some filter capacitors. They had 71 volt filter capacitors, kind of a funny number, right? And it was responsible, it had 68 volts running off it. Is that fine? Yes. Again, they're looking at just getting enough so they can save money per unit. And, you know, in my case, I replaced it with an 80. It's just a little bit better, gives you just a little bit more of a comfort level. Just to talk a little bit more about the capacitor parameters that you'll find at on the manufacturer's websites. Here, you know, it shows a 22,000 microfarad 100 volt capacitor, a typical one that you would use in a vintage stereo restoration. And this particular capacitor is rated at 85 degrees centigrade with a 2,000 hour life expectancy. And you think to yourself, man, 2,000 hours, that doesn't sound that good. But first of all, 85 degrees Celsius is 185 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's pretty darn hot if your stuff's running at that temperature. But if you figure 2,000 hours and you divide 365 days into that, that's 5.5 hours a day. And you're thinking to yourself, man, that's not very good. I run this thing in my office. 5.5 hours a day for a year. But if you lower it to 75 degrees Celsius, which is still a frying 167 degrees Fahrenheit, you double the life expectancy of that capacitor. So parameters, you've got to dig deeper to really take a look at, you know, what their life expectancies are. Because if you just take that raw number, 1,000 hours, 2,000, most of them go 1,000 up to 10,000. And many that I use are 2,000, 5,000, you know, in that range. But if you look at all the parameters, all of the manufacturers, basically what they're going to tell you is you're probably going to get 15 to 20 years out of these capacitors and have them still meet their original specs. Okay, to wrap it up, you can probably see I'm kind of in the camp of changing out those old electrolytic capacitors. It's hard to argue from my standpoint with the people who manufacture the product, who design the product, who test and validate the product. All the information in today's world, it's great. It's all online. 40 years ago, 30 years ago, you wouldn't have been able to get this. Somebody would just told you something and you would just either agreed or disagreed. There's no way for you to really do any research of your own. In today's world, all you got to do is go to Google. You can find out everything you ever wanted to know, and a lot of stuff you probably didn't want to know about the reliability and the longevity of electrolytic capacitors. I understand also, though, I'm in a unique situation. I am a collector of the equipment. I love the equipment, but I'm also a repairer and restorer of it. And a lot of you out there are not. You don't work on it. You may have an old receiver, an old amplifier. You may have several pieces. The issue in today's world is really finding anybody to help you out with them. You know, that's very difficult in today's world to find somebody local around you that even if you say, yeah, you know, I mean, I need to get this thing looked at. It's 40 years old. It's 50 years old. There's nobody to look at it. And so you start looking on the internet and you see somebody halfway across the country who looks competent. And then you've got $100 probably in shipping to get it there, $100 back, including the packing, because you got to pack these things like they're going to the moon, and then you're still going to worry about it. So, you know, you've got probably, you know, in the bigger pieces of equipment anyway, a couple $100 of shipping it there and back. And anybody who's competent, if you look out there, they've got a lot of work, because this stuff doesn't, you don't complete it quickly. You know, this isn't something somebody's going to look at. You send them your amplifier receiver, and it's going to take them quite a bit of time. And a lot of times they have quite a backlog. You know, it's nothing to have 60, 90, 120 day waiting periods. So you've got a long waiting period. Then you've got the cost of parts. And let me talk about the cost of parts a little bit. Just about any of the pieces of equipment, even including the filter capacitors, you won't have more than a couple $100 in it. And the filter capacitors in the bigger pieces of equipment will be the majority of the cost. The smaller capacitors and any transistors you want to change out, they're really quite inexpensive. The filter capacitors, like for an example, in my SX-1980 Pioneer, they were about $25 a piece. There's 4 of them, so there's $100, and there might have been another $100 in the rest of the parts, and that was doing an end-to-end restoration. But a big thing you have is the labor cost. It's going to cost you some money, so you've got to decide if you want to do that too. You know, it's going to be several $100s to restore a piece of equipment. Got a couple $100 in shipping. Let's say you've got because if you're shipping it, you're probably going to go right. You're probably going to do the whole thing, because why would you spend a couple $100 to ship it? So you got a couple $100 in parts, and then somebody's labor, and you're probably knocking on $1,000 to have something restored. And that's why a lot of people say the heck with it, and I understand that. I might say the heck with it too. So a lot of my videos I do, just to speak of that, isn't a step-by-step procedure for anyone. It's a lot of pictures, a little bit of talk to just help the average person maybe be able to work on their own equipment. You know, some people can, some people can't. You know, if you can, great. If you're an expert, that's why I hardly ever post online. I don't have any accounts on any of the big audio forums or anything, because I really don't bring nothing to the table. There's people who have forgotten more than I'll ever know on there. Got a half a dozen of those people, and they don't need my help. And the other group is arguing if Marantz is better than Sansui, and that's not my thing either. So I'm trying to carry on here with my videos in a way that today, and 5 years, 10 years, 20 years down the road, somebody may look at them and say, you know, that's going to help me out. I think maybe, you know, I can repair this myself. Because as I said, it's so difficult to find somebody local. It'd be great if you could put it in the car and just drive up the road like you used to be able to. And those days are rapidly coming to an end, because people who used to work on this stuff are either retired or they're passing away and they just can't, and they're not doing it any longer for one reason or another. And just to wrap up, as I said, if you can change out electrolytic capacitors, every manufacturer tells you you really should, because they do have a limited life. But bottom line, it is your equipment. And as I said, it's not so easy to necessarily have your equipment worked on. And if you don't think it's worth doing, you just think, well, it works fine, it's always worked fine, and I'm not going to screw with it, that's okay too, because it's your equipment. You can do with it as you please. So let's say I've convinced you to change out those old electrolytic capacitors in your 50-year-old piece of audio equipment. Now you're asking, well, where do you get the parts? Because if you're thinking that you can't call Sansui or Marantz or Pioneer anymore for your vintage audio equipment to get the parts that you need, you're correct. So you've got to go and find those parts. It's like finding the parts for a 68 Pontiac GTO. You wouldn't call your local Pontiac dealer. Well, I guess you wouldn't call your Pontiac dealer anymore, would you? Now you know I'm old. Anybody younger is listening to this, they're probably thinking, what's a Pontiac? But anyway, you have to do the research yourself, and you have to find the components yourself. So I'm going to go ahead and show you where I feel are the best places to get parts for your vintage audio equipment. So let's get started. Mouser Electronics and DigiKey Electronics are where I feel you should buy most of your parts from. They'll have 95% of the components that you need to keep your vintage audio equipment running or to restore your vintage audio equipment. Now, things like cosmetic pieces, let's say you're missing a volume control on your receiver. You're not finding it here. You're going to have to go to eBay to get something like that. Transistors, capacitors, resistors, those type of components, a lot of people just think they're going to go to these sites and just find their parts. It's going to take you some time, and it's really not that difficult to find the parts, but there's a lot of choices, and you've got to know which ones to use, and that's the difficult part. So I would suggest that you go to some of these audio forums on the internet, or just do a general search on Google, like Pioneer SX-1980 restoration or something like that, and you'll find some long articles on what people have done, what parts they've used, etc., and that'll help you find what you need. From time to time, I'll get asked for my build list for a project. I work on so many different units that I just keep a stock of parts. And normally, the only thing I won't have are those filter capacitors. Anyway, I don't have a bunch of those sitting around, but the rest of the components I order in quantities of 10, 25, maybe even 100 at a time. You can purchase these quite a bit cheaper if you buy them in bulk from both Mouser and DigiKey. And it's just so convenient to just start a project and have all the parts available. Make sure that you have a decent soldering iron. Doesn't have to be high end, but just don't go out to the flea market and buy a $3 one. Spend $30 on a good iron from Amazon or somewhere else, and have a good quality solder also. And a desoldering tool is a wonderful piece of equipment. If you ever do a large project with one, you'll never do another project without one. It's that simple. Tools are so important, and this is one that's very important. But with that being said, that tool's fairly expensive. It's about $300, which is a lot of money, but if you do a lot of these projects like I do, it's a tool that I could not live without. I hope you enjoyed the format of this video. I did it a little bit differently. It was predominantly about my Pioneer SX-1980, the repair, the restoration of it, where I talked about HiFi engine and world radio history, things that would help you no matter if you own a Pioneer, a Sansui, a Marantz, or whatever other piece of equipment. You just fill in the blank. It doesn't have to be a Pioneer SX-1980. It can be any pieces of equipment that you have. I talked about electrolytic capacitors and why I feel they should be changed out in vintage audio equipment. So we went through that a little bit. And the same goes for talking about where to find parts for the equipment. Again, this was about a SX-1980, but it still would fit anyone who's got a vintage piece of audio equipment. You'd go about it the same way. And finally, talking about the repairing of the equipment, about having a quality soldering iron, and thinking about getting a desoldering tool, and those type of things. So I put this one together a little bit differently, because really you could kind of fill in the blank. You could take out the Pioneer SX-1980, and I tried to give you a lot of good information to do your own project. So I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, I'd appreciate a big thumbs up down below. If you're not a present subscriber and you enjoyed this video, I would ask you to please subscribe, and present subscribers, as always, thank you so much. Y'all have a good day.